Shall we? Shall we begin?
Sure, let's go.
All right. So, hello everyone, and welcome. My name is Jessica Hundley. I am a editor and author. I'm the series editor for the Library of Esoterica, which is a esoteric encyclopedia series from TASCHEN. And doing those books, we've had the great pleasure and honor to include some beautiful Ithell Colquhoun imagery in our books. We have some incredible images of hers in our witchcraft book and in our plant magic book. And one of the our main research partners is the Philosophical Research Society, and Kelly, who's the wonderful librarian there, is one of the people that let us know about Ithell's incredible work. And so I'm very excited to go deeper on this incredible artist. We are very lucky to have Amy Hale here, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about Amy, Dr. Amy Hale. She's an Atlanta-based writer, a curator, and critic. She has a PhD in folklore and mythology from UCLA and has published academic and popular articles on a wide range of topics, such as paganism and the New Right, women's esoteric art, Cornish cultural nationalism, Arthuriania, color theory, and occult performance art. And she has written widely on the artist and occultist Ithell Colquhoun, notably the biography Ithell Colquhoun, Genius of Fern, Loved Gully, and is currently editing a selection of Colquhoun's esoteric essays. She's also the editor of essays on women in Western esotericism, Beyond Seeress and Sea Priestesses. And she's contributed gallery texts and essays for a number of institutions, including the Tate, Camden Arts Center, Art UK, Arusha Galleries, Heavenly Records, and Spike Island, Bristol. And you can find out more about Dr. Hale and her work at her website, which is www.amyhale.me. And, she has written, as I said, extensively on Ithell's work. But one of the things we're going to talk about is her incredible writings. Dr. Hale's been writing about Ithell for 23 some odd years.
Yep.
And obviously has remained a constant source of inspiration and, sort of creative, exploration for you. So without further ado, I'm going to let Dr. Hale take over, and we'll go deep on this incredible artist.
Oh, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Jessica. It's really lovely to be here, and thank you so much to the absolutely epic Philosophical Research Society. It's really an honor to have to be able to speak with you today. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Let me trying to figure up. There we are. Okay, there we go. Right. It has taken several decades after her death for the world to start to apprehend the multifaceted brilliance that is Ithell Colquhoun. She was most certainly a force of nature, a prolific artist, essayist, novelist, and poet, whose overriding concerns were with spiritual transcendence and union with the divine energy that animated all matter. For her, surrealism, the artistic affiliation she fiercely asserted for most of her life, provided a method and a framework to explore not only the deepest reaches of her own mind, but also to connect with other beings and dimensions. We are currently witnessing a coalescence of interests that are thrusting Colquhoun's oeuvre into the spotlight. A renewed interest in surrealism, a new critical commitment to amplifying the historical contributions of women artists, a fascination with women and women's magic in general, and crucially, an interest in esoterically motivated art. This cultural moment is truly Colquhoun's perfect storm. Part of Colquhoun's mystique is that people are absolutely fascinated with her commitment to magic and the occult and the ways in which it infused every facet of her life. Women occultists still take a back seat to the big male personalities, such as Gerald Gardner or Aleister Crowley. But historical invisibility does not mean that they did not exist or were not as committed or as innovative. I actually believe that Ithell Colquhoun was one of the most inventive and engaged occultists of the 20th century, and her archives show a magical mind that never stopped. While people are becoming much more familiar with her visual art, and many are inspired by her mid-century psychogeographic travelogues, the depth of her occult practice is evident, yet perhaps more slowly revealed. It was complex and multifaceted, drawing from a variety of traditions and a multitude of layers of esoteric history, some of which need to be excavated to be understood. Today, I will be discussing some of Colquhoun's magical and esoteric essays from a collection I am currently compiling. While I will not have the time to demonstrate the entire breadth and depth of her occult brilliance, I hope to have you at least partially convinced that she was a force to be reckoned with. By way of a short introduction to her life, Colquhoun was born October 9, 1906, in Shillong, Assam, India, to a family with deep roots in Indian colonial administration. Like many children born to British parents in India, she was brought to England while still an infant. She was raised partially in Cheltenham, which has long roots as a center for colonial families from India, providing resources for that unique hybridized culture. Yet her move to England unsettled Colquhoun's own identity for the entirety of her life. She felt uprooted from a land to which she sought connection, and she felt her spiritual constitution and animism made her much more suited to the colorful and esoteric traditions of northern India, where she was born. Instead, she forged a distinctive spiritual and ethnic identity by focusing on her Irish and Scottish ancestry. She believed that Celtic peoples were inherently dreamier and more sensitive to the energetic currents of life and nature, and so she immersed herself in esotericism and the writings of W.B. Yeats and other Irish mystical writers while still in her youth. Her love of Celtic peoples and lands eventually led her to settle part-time in Cornwall in the late 1940s, full-time in 1959, building a perfect home for someone who lived her life traversing various spiritual dimensions. Colquhoun discovered her artistic talents at a very early age, and we see in her teen drawings mythical worlds of fairies, peacocks, and young girls with faraway looks. She was trained early on at Cheltenham Ladies' School and then Cheltenham School of Arts and Crafts. In 1928, at the age of 22, she started at the Slade School of Art, Britain's preeminent art school, where she had a rigorous, multifaceted education in both fine and applied arts. Her love of the occult also developed while she was in her teens, and we can see an early interest in astrology, tarot, and especially alchemy blossoming while she was still quite a young woman. When she arrived at the Slade, she embraced this opportunity to immerse herself in London's bustling occult scene, joining G.R.S. Mead's Quest Society, where she met her cousin and Golden Dawn member Edward Garston, who became a significant influence on her occult development. After she earned her degree, she spent several years in the early 30s traveling in France, Greece, and the Mediterranean, painting and drawing, and falling in love with the Greek woman, Kyria Kazoo. This is an oil painting that she did of her in 1934. She returned home in the mid-1930s to start life as a professional artist. By the time she discovered surrealism in 1936, her esoteric preoccupations were a central defining feature of her life, and her occultism was entwined like knotwork with her art and with her writing. Until recently, Colquhoun was predominantly known for her short-lived relationship with the British Surrealists. Her first encounter with surrealism was at the London International Surrealist Exhibition in 1936. She was immediately hooked, inspired by the dreamlike images and Freudian symbolism employed by Dali and Magritte, which resonated with her. Colquhoun was already interested both in dreams and mythological symbolism, And we see these influences in her earliest surrealist work, exploring themes of wounded sacrificial kings and the divine feminine in the landscape. In 1939, Colquhoun forged a closer association with a group of cutting-edge surrealists in France who were interested in automatism as a technique to reach other dimensions. Colquhoun started to adopt automatic processes in writing and painting that were intended not only to connect with her subconscious mind with her conscious mind, but also to connect her with planes and entities well beyond. She started to use automatic methods as divinatory and invocatory processes, and over the decade, her work moves from dreamlike and highly sexualized images into more abstract pieces filled with texture and color. In fact, her 1949 essay on automatism, The Mantic Stain, was the first to be published in English. Although she officially parted ways with the British Surrealists in 1940, partially because of her commitment to her occult interests, she identified as a Surrealist throughout her life, as Surrealism was, for her, the best way to explore the spaces of magic in her art. The 50s were marked by an increase in her engagement with magical groups, which were finally coming back online after suppression during World War II, and were therefore much more accessible to her. Although the groups she joined appeared to be quite varied, she was mostly drawn to Hermetic and Celtic traditions that reflected a belief in a perennial worldwide wisdom tradition. Starting in the early 1950s, Colquhoun was involved with a variety of esoteric groups, including the Ordo Templi Orientis, the Martinists, Co-Masonry, Druidry, a Golden Dawn-inspired order, and later the Fellowship of Isis and other groups devoted to Celtic spirituality. Although she never became involved in either Wicca or traditional witchcraft, her command of both Wicca and British traditional magic was staggering, and she took great interest in it. She absolutely believed in the existence of an ancient community of powerful priestesses and witches. Her Indian background also gave her a great interest in Indian traditions, particularly Tantra. But for Colquhoun, the Kabbalah and the Golden Dawn were foundational, and her knowledge of these traditions, and also alchemy, were exceptional. This period also saw a renewed focus on building a writing career, with her two successful psychogeographic travelogues, Crying of the Wind, Ireland from 1955, and Livingstone's Cornwall from 1957, both of which today hold the status of proto-Earth Mysteries texts. During this time and through the mid-1960s, we see more of a focus on poetry and the development of a number of unpublished novels. Through the 1960s and 70s, she continued to paint, write, and show, both in Britain and on the European continent. In 1977, 11 years before her death, she produced her automatic masterpiece of a tarot deck, possibly the first abstract deck ever to be created based on Kabbalistic and Golden Dawn color schemes. She was a creative powerhouse until very late in her life, continuing to paint and write only a few years before her death in Cornwall in 1988. For decades, Colquhoun was unappreciated and misunderstood. Although the bulk of her written archives have been in the Tate since her death, the transfer of her visual archives from the National Trust to the Tate in 2019 created the conditions for a whole new generation of researchers to explore her brilliance. As should be evident to anyone who knows Colquhoun's vast body of work, the woman was utterly tireless. I honestly doubt she ever slept. Her legacy includes over 5,000 pieces of visual work, 8 book-length manuscripts, both published and unpublished, poems and prose poems, essays and observations, and an unpublished autobiography of her youth. The subjects she addressed in her writing vacillated wildly, ranging from Celtic magic to alchemy, painting techniques, philosophy, aesthetics, a spiritual tour of Egypt, magical novels, and a truly weird and rambling account of the life of Aleister Crowley. She ranted about the discomfort and oppression of women's clothes and the need to conform to the male gaze. She wrote about all the ways in which women have to hide their light and be socially acceptable at all times. She composed deeply transgressive essays about cannibalism, incest, prostitution, and excrement. She described hiking her skirts and pissing behind a pyramid in one of her unpublished novels. One thing is very certain about Ithell Colquhoun: she was a woman who had something to say. I believe that for Colquhoun, her writing practice was as important to her artistic identity as her visual art. Yet although she had a fairly constant record of publication from the 1940s onward, and wrote quite consistently, her writings only really ever found marginal success during her life, and many remained unpublished until after her death. Her early writings were often provocative and artful essays or poetry published in literary or surrealist magazines. And throughout her life, her shorter form writings were the most successful in terms of publication. Many of her novels remained unpublished, despite the fact that she frequently pushed them to artists and agents and publishers. Her quirky travelogues, Crying of the Wind and The Living Stones, were likely her most popular publications and remain so to this day. Although her short surrealist novella, The Goose of Hermogenes, likely written several decades before its 1961 publication, was critically acclaimed during its day, it was hardly written for a mass audience. Most of her fictional writings were, frankly, somewhat disorganized, turgidly allegorical, and simply challenging to read. Her characters were often poorly developed and seemed to stand in for higher concepts and archetypes rather than operating like fully fleshed out people. Her attempts at nonfiction were often characterized by opinionated intrusion. The Sword of Wisdom, which in many ways was one of the first historical accounts of Samuel MacGregor Mathers and the legacy of the Golden Dawn, was in many ways dismissed by later historians as recounting too many unsubstantiated stories and gossip, and was therefore considered unreliable. I don't agree with that assessment. As with most of Colquhoun's writing, she has no problem with inserting herself into the text, using the beginning section of the Sword of Wisdom as an opportunity to share the important moments in her own spiritual journey with occultism and occult communities. The final appendices are dense chapters of magical theory that, while related to the Golden Dawn, feel tacked on to the rest of the manuscript, primarily added as a sort of magical flex. And flex she could. Colquhoun had an exceptionally wide range of esoteric interests, yet they all seem to converge in a perennialist vision where all genuine paths are part of a revelation of an ancient mystery school of adepts, possibly originating in Atlantis and spreading to elite initiates all over the world. In general, Colquhoun gravitated toward hermetics and organizations that had historical links with the Golden Dawn, as she felt she had been etherically selected as a potential initiate by the disincarnate, astral plane-based secret chiefs of that order. For Colquhoun, that current expressed itself in her intensive explorations of alchemy, witchcraft, Kabbalah, Celtic spirituality, esoteric heraldry, druidry, thelema, tantra, Martinism, and more. The one thing Ithell Colquhoun never wrote is a full-length, non-fiction, instructional, or theoretical text about her magic, and she was far from unique as a woman occultist in this regard. With the exception of the highly influential magician Dion Fortune, who left a treasure trove of books and novels, however flawed and uncomfortable they are to read today, full-length women's magical monographs from this period were rare, and as a woman magician in mid-century Britain, Fortune was rather outstanding in her written legacy. In earlier periods, there were a number of well-known and successful women occult writers of spiritual texts. Of course, Helena Blavatsky is a standout, but Annie Besant and Alice Bailey are also notable. Yet, in the early 20th century, post-Golden Dawn flowering of British occultism, the majority of women interested in hermeticism and magic did not produce full-length texts, although they certainly did publish. There are many reasons why this may be the case. As historian Julia Phillips has noted in her work about Madeleine Montalban, many women esotericists were primarily known for their writing in newspapers and periodicals. This was certainly the case for the influential Montalban, as well as early American esotericist Eleanor Kirk, Doreen Valiente, and of course Colquhoun. British-based occult women found outlets for the writing in periodicals such as Prediction, a popular magazine devoted to esoteric and occult topics, which started in 1936 and which is still in publication. Through this type of popular publishing strategy, women occult writers found an audience and also, importantly, gained some sort of regular income. In the case of Montalban, it allowed for her to also cultivate interest for her Order of the Morning Star through mail order lessons advertised in the back of the publication. But, like Colquhoun, although many of these women are considered key influencers in mid-century British occultism, they never attained the popular reach or name recognition of their male counterparts, such as Crowley, Kenneth Grant, or Gerald Gardner, and as a result, very wrongly have retained a status as merely supporting actors. There may well have been other barriers to women's magical publishing. Funds and marketing have always been factors in publishing decisions, as they are today. And of course, many occult and esoteric publications were privately funded or were attached to spiritual organizations. It is possible that many women occultists didn't have the financial backing or connections to attract a publisher and could not convince publishers that they could gain a readership that was worth the initial investment. This was certainly the case with Colquhoun, who found publishing very difficult in general. Many of her early publishing efforts and early books were likely made possible by personal friendships emerging from her social network, people who really believed in her and valued her voice. Although piles of rejection letters are common for most writers, Colquhoun often faced feedback about her readability and lack of a potential market for her work. It may also be that, unlike Fortune, Colquhoun may have felt that she lacked the authority to produce a monograph. Although Colquhoun had no problems in challenging the top brass of any order with which she was associated, including Fortune's Society of the Inner Light, she never took an outward-facing leadership position. In many ways, she saw herself as a perpetual student and seeker, and was clearly more identified as a professional artist than a professional magician. It may have been that writing a book of that nature would have cut into her painting time in ways that she was not interested in. Yet Colquhoun wrote a lot about magic. A lot. She wrote about all sorts of magic and esoteric subjects, and her preferred format for doing so was the essay. Excuse me, which perhaps allowed for her to experiment with a wider variety of topics. Although the essays in the volume I am compiling started in the late 1920s, as the century went on, Colquhoun's esoteric publishing opportunities increased. Many of her early published writings about magic and the occult were, broadly speaking, in a journalistic context and come from the mid-50s, when she was a writer for the London Broadsheet, edited by her friend Anthony Borrow. She produced interesting profile pieces on Gerald Gardner, Austin Osman Spare, Aleister Crowley, and other esoteric topics, hoping, perhaps, to introduce mid-century British magical personalities to a wider audience. She later published a variety of essays and reviews for Prediction magazine in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s that drew more on her expertise as a practitioner. The growth in occult and countercultural publications and magazines in the 1960s and 70s, and wider access to the engines of publishing and distribution, provided Colquhoun further opportunities to find homes for essays and poems she had likely drafted much earlier, including a piece in the legendary Man, Myth, and Magic, and the long-running magazine devoted to the Celtic mysteries, Or, edited by Colquhoun's friend and early biographer, Eric Radcliffe. Some of her essays reflect very long-standing interests that were likely published long after their composition and which never would have had an appropriate readership decades previously. One example of this is Openings of the Body, a short piece about points of energetic access in which she confidently explains that since women have more openings in the body through which to receive and send energy, that they are naturally superior to men. This image, the 13 Streams of Magnificent Oil from 1940, shows the opening on the female body through which divine energy may enter. The essay was published in 1970, but it reflects a body of work from the early 1940s about energy currents and ultimately her radical views about sex magic. What this tells us is that first, Colquhoun still believed in 1970 that this material was relevant and important to get out there. Second, there were actually publications supporting communities that would publish it. Unfortunately, many of these would be small-run publications that resulted in these being ephemeral. Thus, in the history of Colquhoun's essay publishing career, we can also chart the development of British magical subcultures and the increased popular interest in these topics, and also the role of publishing in creating and cohering communities. Considering the essays chronologically in the collection I am compiling allows the reader to see not only what Colquhoun's progression was in terms of style and topic, but it also gives us the wider cultural context of the growth and development of British esoteric subcultures during her lifetime and her more public-facing intersections with them. In terms of subject matter, the essays chosen for this collection, and this is by no means a comprehensive collection, reflect her range of interests and also her general approach to magic. In some ways, the selections were a result of access, and others I selected because I was interested in reproducing pieces that were theoretically oriented or didactic, rather than descriptive or poetic. I really wanted to highlight her mastery. Some texts were originally published essays. Others were early lectures and pieces perhaps intended for artistic or magical collections that never saw the light of day. In only a few cases, a piece was selected not because it was explicitly occult, but because it reveals something about Colquhoun's values and approach, which of course support her esoteric and magical directions. For example, The Divine Marquis and the Myth of Liberty from the early 1940s was primarily intended as an essay response to the surrealist fetishization of the Marquis de Sade, but it reveals a lot about her positions on liberty and restraint, which greatly intersect with mid-century magical discourses, especially Thelema in the middle of the 1950s. So what sorts of things do we see in this collection? Over the course of her writing, her essays fall into a number of broad categories, but were mostly alchemical, hermetic, and Celtic. Some were more philosophical in nature, explaining features of a profoundly magical worldview. The earliest pieces were taken from lectures she gave at the Quest Society in 1928 and 1930, when she was 22 and 24 years old. The London Quest Society was founded by the esoteric philosopher and classicist G.R.S. Mead. Mead was a theosophist with a deep interest in Hermetic texts and Gnosticism, and founded the Quest Society in 1909 with disaffected Theosophical Society members who left after the organization found itself in scandal. The society had about 150 members, many luminaries from the occult and esoteric world at the time, and hosted lectures and discussion, much of which likely seeded Mead's periodical, The Quest. Colquhoun's engagement with this group gives us quite an indication of not only her mental horsepower, but also her moxie, as even at this tender age, she had no problem addressing a large group and sharing bold opinions. Imagine Colquhoun, a confident, young, 22-year-old woman in 1928, standing in front of a group of stuffy, eccentric occultists, probably mostly male, and likely just as feisty and difficult back then as they are today. Delivering a blistering response to a previous speaker, a Reverend Ethelbert Goodchild, who gave a lecture to the Quest Society on the nature of the divine. In her withering lecture titled In Search of the Divine, she basically accused Reverend Goodchild as offering no useful content and no practical advice to go on. She came out swinging and pulled no punches, and this unwavering character never retreated throughout the entirety of her life. Her next two offerings for the Quest Society were also heavy hitters, dense in writing and concept. Her Prose of Alchemy, published in the Quest magazine in 1930, demonstrated her alchemical chops, consisting of a survey of Colquhoun's favorite alchemical texts, exploring style and description, attempting to lure people into alchemy through a focus on alchemical writing techniques. The substantial essay, The Connection Between Mysticism and Blasphemy, was delivered as a lecture to the Search Society, formed by her cousin Edward Garstin in the wake of the demise of Mead's Quest Society in around 1930. This is a thoughtful and sophisticated analysis of blasphemy, as defined by the sacred in the material, and by the idea that mysticism is blasphemous because it presupposes a merging of the mystic with the deity. This is just a really interesting little section from this text. Thus, though the blasphemer may be said to lower the divine, while the mystic raises himself to meet his Lord, yet in fact, both perform the same process, that of bringing the divine and the human into contact. Since any vehicle cannot be unworthy of divinity, the doctrine of the incarnate God and the whole train of sacramental teaching that follows in its wake is, in this sense, blasphemous. Her early writings, as we might imagine, were sometimes a bit overwrought and opaque, but they are exceptionally noteworthy in that we can see her wrangling with challenging concepts and, above all, not fearing to put her ideas forward. In the 1940s, she published a couple of pieces in literary magazines that were not necessarily didactic, but they were significant in that we see in them the philosophical foundations of some of her practical occult work. Perhaps the most important of these is 1943's Waterstone of the Wise, a response to André Breton's concerns about the flagging surrealist movement during wartime. It was a revolutionary essay replete with alchemical polemic, bringing her engagement with surrealism into a different political and philosophical conversation, one which championed individual thought and the power of the mythic to reshape reality. The title of her essay comes from the alchemical treatise, The Sophic Hydrolith, written in 1619 by printmaker Johann Ambrosius Siebmacher. The Sophic Hydrolith reveals that the philosopher's stone is the earthly substance of Christ, or the perfect light of God, that which was known to the patriarchs. Few adepts throughout history were pure enough to receive the knowledge. The stone itself embodies the perfect and non-gendered Adam from before the fall, when humanity was united with Christ and thus completely united with the divine, symbolizing the fully realized divine human. It was this state that Colquhoun sought, and this enigmatic non-gendered being and its formation was a significant theme in Colquhoun's magical art and experimentation in the early 1940s. She wanted humanity to aspire to and reach its divine potential, but to do this, a new mythic foundation needed to emerge. No more tyrants and victims. No more the fevered alternations of that demon star which sponsored the births of de Sade and von Sacher-Masoch, but the hermaphroditic whole, opposites bound together in mitigating embrace by a silkworm's thread. The new myth, the myth of the Siamese twins, will make of him a forgotten bogey. In one of the planetary houses lived the twins, a boy and a girl perpetually joined by an ectoplasmic substance which is warmed by the solar and lunar currents of their bodies. They cannot part, nor do anything apart. They eat and breathe each other day and night. They are united face to face, having passed forward to the condition of the androgynous egg. Their faculty is dream, their body of fate the stream of images, sensual transpositions, induced by the incandescence of their own body and mind. They have no privacy from each other and desire none, since theirs is a unity conscious of its own elements. They weigh down equally each scale of the balance, and as the two fishes are held together in a watery dance by a single cord. Colquhoun envisioned this cocoon as the place of gestation for a liberated and an evolved society, since this is the vision of the perfected state which existed in the Garden of Eden prior to the separation of man and woman. For Colquhoun, this was a myth of liberation, two souls eternally conjoined as a hermaphroditic whole, and in their perfection having the ability to live in the superconscious world of dreams, the realm of myth, free from both conflict and desire. Colquhoun's essays for Prediction magazine were among her most complex for a popular audience. It is clear that the audience for this journal was in her sweet spot for topics she had a command of. She published 17 pieces for Prediction over a time span ranging from 1958 to 1973. The topics ranged from primers on Kabbalah, the Celtic mysteries, sacred places, profiles of Aleister Crowley and Samuel MacGregor Mathers, meditation techniques, and sacred heraldry. In 1958, she completed a 4-part series titled The Crown and Kingdom for Prediction, which it is clear that she had envisioned as an introduction to the topic. However, as was Colquhoun's way, she likely threw her readers into the deep end of the pool without a float. Here's a brief excerpt from the 1958 essay, The 10 Sephiroth, which was the second in the series. Those who are perplexed about the problem of evil have not delved deeply enough. The question is not why should evil exist, but why should the absolute change into some lesser thing? Such answers as that it is in order to gain experience or to become conscious of itself are so plainly inadequate that one would rather leave the question unanswered, accepting the fact of emanation, manifested existence, simply as the way things are. This strikes me as rather deep pondering for a popular magazine with ads for Lucky Piskies in the back. Colquhoun was also fascinated by what I refer to as esoteric heraldry, and there are lots of heraldic drafts among her papers. This makes sense, as in the history of heraldry is one of the first places we find applications of esoteric color theory, and this may even be potentially the root of the magical motto. Colquhoun was a philosophical traditionalist, and once joined an order that included a focus on esoteric heraldry. Indeed, her short essay, Banners in the Sky, published in Prediction in 1973, was about the esoteric symbolism that one finds on heraldic banners, connecting them to the rulers and families that bear them. She argued that the colors of heraldic banners connect rulers and states to specific planetary powers. A glance at the connection between astrology and the heraldic colors, from which those flags derived, is quite illuminating. Thus, each heraldic tincture invokes the power of the planet to which it is attributed. This seems like a quirky little piece, but it actually reflects Colquhoun's lifelong interest in the ways that color could not only be used as an invocation of powers, but how the display of that color had real-world effects. A few of the pieces in the collection were not, as far as I know, ever published, but which capture her working out of various magical theories and experiments. One such piece of incredible complexity is her dimensional interrelation, a meditation on the Platonic solids, likely written in the 1950s or early 1960s, and which actually helps provide an esoteric concept for some of her mid-century art. I actually believe that much of this was inspired by René Guénon's symbolism of the cross. This is a weird one, so please try to hang in there with me. This essay addresses her experiments with creating, building up, and breaking down Platonic solids in geometric forms. Although her ultimate intention is not clear, she may have been attempting to cultivate a particular technique of gaining extra-dimensional sight through provoking physical breaks between dimensions. As she described the process in the essay, she would start with a 2-dimensional form, then build it up into 3 dimensions, only to open it flat and build it up again. She called this process dimensional exchange, and she would continue this process until the form began to physically break down and lose spatial integrity. She noted that the cube was the form which maintained integrity the longest, the one she could build up and break down the most times. She completed this process with a square and then expanded it to a form of 106 squares and 26 cubes. Her records show that she was undertaking these experiments herself with a number of figures, including the Phi-Alpha crosses, which are a geometrical figure used in Golden Dawn rituals from the 19th century. We also call them swastikas, pyramids, dodecahedrons, and octahedrons, and this was clearly an important magical experiment for her. So she notes, each Platonic solid is defined in space by equal and regular planes. Its sides and a 2-dimensional figure may be taken as the basis of each, with a rhythm or pulsation between the 2nd and 3rd dimensions established by experiment. Her reporting on this project sounds somewhat obsessive and definitely wacky, but it's worth getting a taste of it to understand her thought process. So here on the image on the right is not actually an image that is describing what you're seeing on the screen, but it gives you an idea of what she was doing in characterizing the third dimension of a series of crosses. But I do have a slide of the actual process. So she says, better known as the cube, this figure springs from the two-dimensional square. Raise each side of this square to produce another square, and a solid composed 6 square faces will be defined, so building up a cube from a square. Open this out as a two-dimensional figure and it becomes a cross. So basically, cut the cube out and you will get a flat cross from the cube. Open this out as a two-dimensional figure and it becomes a cross, while the number of squares composing it remains as 6. Construct this cross as a three-dimensional figure and the number of square faces increases to 26, 6 cubes. Open this out again as a two-dimensional figure and a more elaborate cross results, the number of square faces remaining at 26. Construct this as a three-dimensional figure and their number increases to 106, 26 cubes. So I know this sounds wacky, so thanks for hanging in there with me. But this is an example of what she was doing with the Philpott cross. So you see here on the left, this is the two-dimensional image of this. And what she would do is, this is a drawing of the three-dimensional image, but she was actually building models. She was actually building three-dimensional models and then kept breaking them down until the figure didn't retain any structure. Although I'm aware that this is really hard to follow, I really wanted you to get an insight into her own unique process and the complexity that went into many of the magical experiments that often infused her art. Celtic spirituality is one of the other persistent streams of Colquhoun's spiritual life. William Butler Yeats was a formative influence and stayed so throughout her life. In fact, she believed him to have been a prophet, and his unique blend of Celtic-flavored Hermeticism likely impacted both her interest in the Golden Dawn and also various Celtic magics. As early as the 1940s, Colquhoun wrote a short critical piece explaining the importance of Yeats' challenging and opaque text of vision, co-channeled with his wife Georgie in the 1920s, and was first privately published in 1925. This mix of notions of cyclical time and alchemical metaphor proved central to Colquhoun's ideas about alchemically derived social reform in the 1940s, seen most directly in her essay, Waterstone of the Wise. The essay was never published, but she delivered it as a lecture and actually gave a copy to Yeats' widow for comment. Colquhoun was so inspired by Yeats, she also derived a magical operation based on a vision using sigillized statements of intent as one might find in Austin Osman Spare's work, placed in the quadrants of one of Yeats' diagrams, working with his ideas of faculties on the cyclical wheel. So once again, we see another series of extremely complex magical operations, this one called Pantacle of the Earthly Paradise, based on Yeats's very complicated work of vision. Although Colquhoun had been interested in Druidry and emerging Celtic spirituality since the 1950s, most of her publishing on these topics happened as a result of the wider Celtic revival in the 1970s, inspired by a convergence of Celtic politics, earth mysteries, and the growing environmental movement. Although from the late 1950s, Colquhoun was involved with a number of spiritual orders, which had links with the generally romantically inspired Celtic past, her publishing on Celtic topics starts much later, in the late 1960s. This is one area where we see the convergence in publishing opportunities and an increase in popular interest, since it's likely that Colquhoun had been working on the theoretical foundations of these essays much earlier. She published on Welsh mythology, earth mysteries, modern Druidry, the Holy Grail, and Robert Graves' Celtic tree alphabet, of which she was quite fond. And so here I just want to show this cool 1949 painting, The Battle Fury of Cuchulainn, which shows him there in his warp spasm. It shows just kind of the depth and length of her interest in Celtic topics. So again, prediction proves to be a good landing spot for some of her Celtic essays. In the first of her Wisdom Tradition of the Gale series, published in Prediction in 1968, Colquhoun addressed the likely occult training that would have occurred in the fabled cities of the Tuatha De Danann of Irish legend, linking these to other esoteric concepts, such as the watchtowers of the four quarters and the elements. Colquhoun was generally happiest if she could find a variety of esoteric correspondences for any idea, which likely indicated for her the inner truth of the concept. In the second of the series, Colquhoun works to carry on Yeats's project of mapping Irish figures of mythology onto the Kabbalistic tree of life, to help provide a framework for conjuring them in order to more fully realize the creation of a center for Hibernian mysteries. This essay of hers has a really challenging section that I don't want to gloss over. Although Colquhoun didn't often directly address issues of race or nativism directly, the connection between perceived race or ethnicity and esoteric practice was something she clearly considered and had views on. In this essay, Colquhoun deviates into some unfortunate views, suggesting that each race has an appropriate venue or style for esoteric practice. She notes that she doesn't believe that this is a racist perspective and that all magical systems are equally useful. Sadly, this is a rather common perspective in the history of 20th century occult subcultures, and we see it ranging in writings from Dion Fortune to John Michel. Yet this isn't a perspective Colquhoun articulates consistently, certainly not with respect to her own changing interests, which included Tantra, Buddhism, yoga, and Sufism. Yet I feel it's important to acknowledge this perspective when it arises, and to look more closely at the context in which it emerges, to understand what has influenced this type of writing at this date. Moving on, however, another possibly more perfect home for a number of her writings was Adam McLean's Hermetic Journal. Today, McLean is known for his very impressive web collection of alchemical documents and engravings, but a number of years ago, he and Richard Shillito were actually the first to reproduce Colquhoun's 1977 tarot deck. McLean's Hermetic Journal was a really wonderful collection of advanced occult and esoteric essays written by a variety of authors. By the way, you can actually get back copies of the Hermetic Journal through McLean's website and also on Amazon. They're very worth it. It was a really very unique journal. In 1979, Colquhoun submitted several technical essays primarily involving color magic: the zodiac and the flashing colors, color and the two sigils, note on the coloring of Homer's golden chain diagram. The uses and magical applications of color magically were of continuing and persistent importance to Colquhoun, and it's also likely not a coincidence that these essays came 2 years after she designed her tarot deck. These were quite practical essays, providing color schemes and directions for creating various sigils and images that one could magically use. In the Zodiac and the Flashing Colors, she writes, basic to much that was taught in the Order of the Golden Dawn is the doctrine that color applied to certain objects and allied, I think I have a slide of this. I do. Color applied to certain objects and allied with certain mental praxes may be the instrument of a change in consciousness. Though nowhere definitively stated in its instruction papers, this teaching is nevertheless implicit in their contents. According to it, color provides an avenue into worlds or spheres of being other than that recognized by everyday perception. And then she continues with concrete directions. The sigils of the zodiacal signs should be painted in an appropriate color upon a background of its spectral opposite. Thus, Aries is bright red on a ground of emerald. The pigments must be luminous but not transparent and must be evenly applied. The exact shade of each must be found so as to make a complete contrast with its opposite. Order paper suggests that enamel paints must be used or colored paper to give the required tone intensity and evenness of surface. So it came about that a magical order was advocating the methods of collage and op art more than 50 years before such procedures filtered to the art circles of Europe. She suggests that these cards can be used in a personal temple for meditation and altering one's consciousness. Her other essays for the series on Homer's golden chain and the sigillum del ameth found on Dee's wax tablet suggest that color is necessary to make them fully operational. And this is such a wonderful and indicative quote of hers. To me, a sigil does not begin to live until it is represented in color. And to conclude, Colquhoun was publishing, creating, and painting up until nearly the end of her life. In Colquhoun's final few years, she stopped publishing significant theoretical essays and focused more on poetry and atmospheric musings on place and history. Notably, she was publishing more with the small pagan and goddess-focused magazine called Wood and Water, which had a really lovely anti-nuclear and explicit ecological focus. Given that Colquhoun had always had an interest in conservation and was firmly anti-development, it seems that she had found a culture that somehow fit her politics in the end. This is just another way that the world needed to catch up with Colquhoun, as she was consistently miles ahead of us. Maybe we finally are. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I will happily engage in discussion and take questions if you like.
Thank you so much, Amy. Yes, if anyone has any questions, please type them in the chat. And I was wondering, Amy, if you would want to talk about going through the contents of Ithell's studio, which you were able to do in any of those discoveries that you made.
Sure. So as I mentioned, her studio, the contents of her studio were actually transferred to the Tate in 2019, which was a cause of celebration for many of us who had been working with her archives. So when she died in 1988, in her will, she left the contents of her studio to the National Trust. And she, I kind of had wondered how she was feeling when she did that, because she had actually instructed the National Trust to sell them off and buy land for conservation in Cornwall. None of this really is particularly the National Trust's remit. So I'm exceptionally grateful that the people at the National Trust, who were kind of then found with this collection of 5,000 pieces that they had to conserve, actually had the vision to hold on to it and take care of it the best that they could, because occult surrealist art is obviously not their wheelhouse. So I'm really glad that they were such thoughtful caretakers of this collection for so long. When I first saw it, when I was first able to see it, it was, I think, 2009. And it was in a shed at a National Trust property. It was not cataloged. And in fact, it's still only just beginning to be cataloged right now. It's an intense collection. And I sat in a room and people just brought me envelope upon envelope as I was sitting in this room. And there were a number of things that struck me about the collection. And I actually have digital images of much of it. And I go down a rabbit hole every time I look, because there's so much there. So things which are super fascinating about her collection. The first thing that struck me, so much intense magical exploration in there. Unbelievable. Also, a lot of the pieces of her various automatic experiments are there intact in absolutely fantastic condition. A lot of sex magic, a lot of erotic stuff in there. That's absolutely wild. Looking forward to sharing that with folks in the future. Also, she took a huge interest in architecture, and specifically fantastic architecture. She's got a lot of really wildly colored buildings in there, from things I think she was doing not just as a student, but also in the later 1930s. I think there's a lot of room to look at what she thought she was doing. And, the public facing use of color for her was clearly something that she was interested in from a very early age. So I think there's a lot going on there. But yeah, her visual archives are amazing. They continue to be a revelation to me. And I'm just so glad that the Tate is caring for them.
Thank you. Well, it looks like there aren't. Oh, here we go. This is from Ali. Are there any records of Ithell exploring herbalism or ecology in her practice?
That's a really great question. I don't see, and now I feel like I want to go back and see if there's anything I missed. I don't see a lot of explorations of use of magical herbs. I expect she knew a bit about it because she was really interested in traditional British magic. She had a profound ecological awareness, however. She was extremely concerned with issues of noise pollution. She was a member of the Society for Noise Abatement, which still exists, and to which she's actually left a portion of her legacy, and her copyright goes there. So she was in general very anti-development. She really believed in the value of green space and the value of quiet, which I think is quite wonderful. I actually share her love of that. In terms of other types of healing, she was very interested in psychic healing, and she actually sought out psychic practitioners and psychic healers, certainly in the last part of her life, second half of her life, but that was something that she believed very strongly in. But yeah, I haven't seen a lot on herbalism. Now I kind of want to go back and have a look, see if there's anything I missed.
Thank you. And from Carrie, are there any details that stood out to you about her home and how she used her home as a container? What were her creature habits? And then Carrie comments she really likes the last photo you showed.
Thank you. I thought that was really that was a really nice piece to end on, because it shows her as an older woman in her garden, and I think that piece was either late 70s or early 80s, and I really loved that. There are some domestic photos of her home. Her home mostly in Paul, which is a small village in West Cornwall, kind of between Newlyn and Mousehole, if you know Cornwall at all. What's interesting is that I expect that she probably had meditation and temple spaces in her home, but I don't know. I don't have any images of them that I have seen so far. I know that she had sets of magical tools of varieties, but how she used her home is actually a really excellent question. Her studio space that she had in Lamorna was quite small. It was quite unprovisioned. It was quite sparse. And that was something that she really valued about it. Now, we have to remember she also had she had a second home and studio in London as well. So I kind of see it as this sort of cultivated sparseness that she was doing when she was down in Lamorna. But yeah, how she used her home, that's a really great question. And it will prompt me to think about that further. Have a look at some of those old photos.
Okay, and from Noelle, they ask, they actually say, thank you so much for an amazing talk. Was Ithell well known before she died?
That's also a really great question. She had periods of being, I think, more well known than not. I think that, because she showed pretty consistently. When she wasn't, in the beginning of her artistic career, she was really quite well known as a surrealist. And she was kind of, in 1939, she was kind of one of the big rising stars of surrealism. So she was definitely known. I think toward the end of her life, and certainly after her death, she was less known. There were people who actually did know of her more as an occultist than they did her surrealism, because of her links with the Sword of Wisdom. So she kind of had these areas where she had stood out, but she was not super famous. No, and I think that her fortunes there kind of dwindled in her later years, although she was still showing at the Newlyn Gallery and other places around Cornwall. So was she famous? Not as famous as she's gonna get, I'll tell you what.
Okay. Steve asks, does her art show a movement from representational to more abstract during her career?
Absolutely. Yes. Her earliest pieces, of course, a lot of the things that we see in the Slade, from when she was a student, she was, if you look at those early pieces from the 1920s, 1930s, we see a lot of what you might consider the standard compositional subjects for students during that era. So a lot of, kind of super interesting takes on classical and biblical themes. Then in the early 1930s, she starts moving into very intensive studies of vegetation. She does a lot of floral pieces, which is kind of interesting. They're very representational. And then they slide into super sexy. Like there are a lot of very explicit visual metaphors in some of her early plant pieces. And then she moves kind of into this kind of mythic, I call it sort of like almost a Magritte phase, where she's doing this kind of dreamy representationalism. But then, 1940s, 50s, she kind of is moving much more toward abstraction, which ends up really being the automatism that she finds is really propels her into, I think, is predominantly abstract work. She still does do occasionally some representational work, but mostly she is an abstract artist in the latter part of her career.
Okay, thank you. And have you found any interesting ways Ithell used tarot that deviates from common modern practice?
Yeah, so her relationship with the tarot is super interesting because, anybody who's interested in the occult is obviously and art is going to have some sort of relationship with the tarot. And so I think I'm not a tarot specialist, but even if you look at kind of the history of tarot, and this is a bit of a tangent, there's this kind of interesting break, I think, between the major arcana and the minor arcana. And the way that a lot of early tarot people, like when tarot was first becoming, popular in the 19 teens, when we start having like decks available to people in the English speaking world, it's this kind of funny thing about, well, really this is about a spiritual journey. And you're not supposed to be doing any kind of real divination work with it. You're certainly not supposed to be doing fortune telling because that's spiritually degraded. But if you have to do it, here's a little bit on how you do that. So there's always this kind of strange aspect to contemporary tarot that it's like, well, we don't want to do base material fortune telling with it. It's supposed to be higher dimensions. And I think ultimately through her life, what we see is, her earliest kind of bits of tarot, which, she has some pieces in her archive that are, kind of more representational imagery. But by the time we see her tarot in 1977, when we see that emerge, which is absolutely an amazing piece or set of pieces, 78 pieces, they're all color. And, if you remember that quote that I put in there about the way that color is supposed to transport you, she didn't want those cards to be read. They weren't for readings. They were for meditation. You were supposed to listen to the card. You were supposed to have the experience of those archetypes that were contained in the pure color. And you were supposed to look at the title and be transported through the color of those cards. So she really did not intend for those to be used in readings. She was very explicit about that. And I think that is, it's bold, and that it's a completely unique and luminous set of paintings. It's absolutely magnificent.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Carl asks, do you know if alchemy was a laboratory practice as well as a spiritual practice? Did Ithell engage in physical alchemical experiments?
So she did not, as far as I know. But I believe that her cousin did. This is something I don't know a lot about, but I believe that her cousin did. Her cousin, Edward Garston, who was the Cancellarius of the Alpha and Omega Lodge in London, he may have been working with somebody who was doing physical alchemy. He at least knew of people who were and had notes on them. So she was definitely interested in people who were fooling around with that, but I don't believe that she did it herself. I think she felt that alchemy was maybe something that you could do with your body in a kind of sexy way. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I think that's all of the questions, but thank you so much for those answers.
Oh, well, you're very welcome. It was an absolute pleasure. Great questions too.
Thank you so much. That was amazing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It was really, really wonderful. This was an excellent time today. Thank you so much for having me.
And Kelly, are we potentially be able to have this for people to watch and download later?
Yeah, we would like to add it to our YouTube channel.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you especially for sharing your deep knowledge and intimacy with Ithell's legacy. It's such a really beautiful thing. I feel like you're almost channeling her in a lot of ways. So we are lucky to be able to have you here with us and sharing all this amazing knowledge that you have. So thank you.
Oh, it was an absolute pleasure. And yes, behind me, I have something that this is what all of us in the kind of the Ithell community, this is something that my friend Lally Macbeth in Cornwall made it. So it's the hand of Ithell, because pretty much anybody who has been touched by Ithell Colquhoun, their lives are never the same. So may you all be so blessed.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day wherever you are.
Bye.